Wouldn't you not say that the arrow was pointing more in the direction of the possibility and potential probability of a zero-troop option? If not just because of the downslope that things are on the status of conversations between the two governments, but you're not even talking about a bilateral security agreement. And the president's made clear without that, there's not going to be troops after 2014. So isn't the probability of that decision being made more likely now than it was 6 months ago when you acknowledged it was possible?
No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think that it's certainly no more possible today than it was a week ago prior to the article being published. The option has always been available, and it is part of a process that is focused not on troop numbers, but on policy objectives. And how do we best do that? And part of how we best do that is how do we, if we do decide to leave a residual force there in pursuit of these policy objectives, what kinds of agreements do we have with the Afghan government going forward with regards to that residual force? And that's an ongoing process. So the suggestion that we're somehow close to a determination or a conclusion in that negotiation is incorrect. There is no decision imminent, and there need not be. We are on a downward slope. We are continuing to draw down our forces. We're roughly at 60,000, I believe, and the president publicly stated that he's committed to bringing that troop level down even further come early 2014. In the end, the residual force and whether there is one will depend on our negotiations with the Afghans and on our assessment of the best way to achieve our policy objectives, as I laid out. And this was the virtue and the clarity that was provided by the President's review of our Afghan policy back in 2009, which required, after many years of drift, intense focus on what our objectives would be and why we were there in the first place, and what the recognition that we would not, and this goes to the reconciliation process, that we were not committed to a U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan simply for the sake of a U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan. We are there, our men and women are there, fighting and in some cases dying for clear objectives of U.S. national interests. And they will continue to fulfill that mission. And going forward after 2014, there will be very clear objectives for our policy in Afghanistan, and those objectives may be met by a residual force of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, or they may be met through other means. I mean, there are other ways to train and equip security forces, and there are other ways, obviously, to continue our efforts against remnants of al-Qaeda.
But isn't it true that the awkward launch of the peace talks, I mean, Karzai denounced them the next day, there is not a conversation currently going on at any productive level on a bilateral security agreement? Don't those two factors complicate this decision-making process and conversations about these entire issues?
If I allowed the predicate here and said yes, that would only be true if we had to make a decision tomorrow. But there's no decision that's imminent. And I have been, and you have been, an observer of, and in my case now a participant in, at least in an outer circle way, this process for some time now, and there have long been ups and downs in these conversations that we've had, and we have.
And we're on a downward slope now,
no,
right?
I think that we can go back over time and look at assessments that say things are on a downward slope, to use your language, and then we continue to have our conversations and we continue to focus with our Afghan counterparts on our shared objectives. And we pursue those objectives together, and we expect that we will be able to do that going forward.
Okay, on Egypt, if I heard you correctly, you were at least encouraging the Muslim Brotherhood to reconsider their announced intention not to participate in this timeline. What is your message to them, broadly speaking, because they might reasonably say, we did participate, and things have been changed in an anti-democratic way after the will of the people was counted and adduced to be conducted fairly? What incentive does the Muslim Brotherhood have for getting back into a process that they saw completely taken off track?
Well, I think that goes to the incredible complexity and difficulty of this situation. And it is why we expressed, and the President expressed his deep concern about the removal of President Morsi from office by the Egyptian Armed Forces. What we have to focus on is, where do we go from here? How do we return to a democratically elected civilian government? And the best way to do that and the best way to ensure that that does not that the return to democratically elected elected government is not an end point, but the beginning point of a process that has democracy becoming embedded in Egyptian society and in the state, is to make sure that all elements of Egyptian society are participating in this process. And that it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult, but the alternative is a continued crisis and continued political polarization. And when it comes to what individuals or which individuals will lead Egypt in the future, that's for the Egyptian people to decide, and it's for the Egyptian people to decide in a democratic process. And as I said yesterday, and I'll say again today, when it comes to what happened in Egypt, it is important to note that millions and millions of Egyptians were extremely unhappy with the undemocratic governance under President Morsi. And what the president has long said, as it applies to Egypt and as it applies elsewhere around the world, democracy is not elections alone. A successful election, a free and fair election with a result, is not the endpoint to democracy. It is an ongoing, organic process that involves participation by everybody in the political process and compromise, constant compromise between parties and groups with differing objectives. And that's what we call on the Egyptian people and all the groups involved here to recognize and accept, and that is reconciliation over conflict, peaceful dialogue over violent confrontation.
I want to talk one more thing about the aid question. Understanding this is complex and difficult, but the law is the law, and what I'm curious about is why the administration won't just say the law doesn't apply because it's not a coup, and we're going to go forward with our own strategic objectives, because there's a certain element of what you're saying that sounds like it's a difficult law, it's very complicated to live up to it, and that sounds like you're sort of creating a space for you to not adhere to the law, when the law, as many members of Congress, very senior experience, say is absolutely clear on this particular subject.
Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is that in the process of making a determination and making a designation, we will take the time necessary that will allow us to pursue our policy objectives that are in the interest of the United States and of the Egyptian people.
I mean, it's clear this administration doesn't believe it was a coup. Why not just make that authoritative assessment and move on?
I think what I've made clear is that the designation carries with it very significant consequences, and that we have policy objectives here when it comes to the return to a democratic government in Egypt, and hopefully a return to some stability in Egypt that remains our #1 objective, and that we will take the time necessary as we review our legal obligations and as we consult with Congress when it comes to this issue of designating and labeling the events that took place, because we believe that's in the best interest of the United States.